Barbarians is a new show on Netflix that depicts conflict between the Roman Empire and Germanic peoples. And in it, we hear actual spoken Latin. But how is the Latin? Is it historically accurate? Is it pronounced well? In this video, we'll be going over almost every line of Latin dialogue in the first episode of the show Barbarians. I'm Luke, and this is polýMATHY. First, I want to give a shout out to my friend Metatron, who has already made videos about this show Barbarians and about the actual historical events and culture surrounding the story. In fact, you can see him speaking Latin in one of his most recent videos. I got to help him out a little bit with the Latin dialogue. It's always wonderful to hear an Italian pronouncing beautiful classical Latin. It sounds great. All right, let's jump right into the first Latin scene.
Caesar sanctae urbis Romae Augustus, novum legatum ad Germaniam misit, senatorem publium quintilium varum.
All right, so immediately I'm impressed. The Latin in this show overall, you should know, is very good sounding. It's definitely a far cry from other depictions in movie and cinema where we've seen Latin before. In particular, he's using the restored classical pronunciation of Latin. So he's saying, for example, Caesar, he's not saying Caesar, which would be typical. This actor is Italian, and he's doing really well. Clearly, the language coaches worked with these Italians to get them used to the ancient pronunciation. Very few Italians, academically or in school, where they do study a lot of Latin, actually use the restored classical pronunciation of Latin. They use the ecclesiastical pronunciation of Latin, which I think is perfectly fine to use as a way to understand and appreciate the language. I've spoken about this topic extensively, and you can see some of my other videos about that topic. However, historically speaking, we should be hearing classically pronounced Latin, and this is the 1st century AD. Classical Latin starts around 100 BC or 70 BC. It goes to either 120 or 200 AD, this classical Latin literature, so that's the pronunciation that we usually work with. Now, since we're going to talk about this in detail, I'm going to nitpick a lot of little things, but that's what you're here for. The first thing I hear is I do hear him saying misit instead of misit, or misit. It actually should be a retracted S, and should be a s sound, not a z or a z sound. I hear that, but it's difficult because he's shouting. It's possible that he's actually trying to say misit, and it's just sounding a little bit voiced. It should be an unvoiced sound. Another thing I hear, he says senatorem, senatorem. Now, what's wrong with that is that senatorem, senatorem, the a is long. And phonemic vowel length is something you've heard me talk about in other videos. And this is one of the most important parts about appreciating Latin in any time period, because the Latin language, its grammar, is based off of phonemic vowel length. Whether it's conventionally pronounced by people or not is immaterial. In this time period, we would definitely hear phonemic vowel length pronounced by all groups of people, whether people speaking common Latin, vulgar Latin, classically educated Latin, it doesn't matter. The phonemic vowel length is going to be here in almost every speaker's voice. So senatorem, he says senatorem. He makes the a too short. Okay, so this is interesting. This is not a pronunciation thing, but he says the word futuite. Now, this is an expletive. I've even blocked out the bit of English text here on the screen. This is a word in Latin which can be equated to the F word, which I'm not going to say here because I want to keep this video PG. And the usage, however, is incorrect. Despite the similarity, it doesn't actually mean the same thing as the English F word in this particular situation. And the usage of this word definitely didn't feel right to me. Just to make sure, I asked Martinus Loch. You've seen him and me and Irene Regini speaking Latin with Gia from Romanian with Gia. We're speaking in Latin. Martinus Loch, fantastic Latin speaker, and he specializes in this taboo language, or what is, at least for us, offensive language in graffiti and in literature, and I confirmed with him that this usage is definitely not at all right. And if you want to see Martinus and me and Irene speaking in Latin, then you'll find the link to that video in the description as well. I have made a whole video for my Patreon supporters where I talk about in detail some of the most important expletives or shall I say, more taboo words in Latin vocabulary that can be found in literature as well as graffiti. And I make that available just to my Patreon supporters because I want to keep this channel nice and PG as much as I can. But just to talk about this word futuite is not right here. It isn't used this way. It's being used as an imperative. He's saying to the guys he's talking to, which have to be his fellow comrades, since it's the imperative plural, go do, and this verb. But it doesn't mean what could synonymously mean be like dang or damn, or because he's saying, dang, these beasts don't understand a thing, right? So that's an issue. Well, so what word is appropriate here in Latin? Well, that word would be me Hercules, or Hercle, swearing by a particular god, in this case Hercules, the demigod who is deified in Roman civilization. But this is not an offensive word, whereas the F word, or even saying damn or even dang, has a kind of, almost taboo kind of feeling to it, particularly damn. It's not like that with the word Hercle or me Hercules. It's more of a reinforcing word. Of course, a lot of people use some stronger, slightly, mildly taboo words like damn in English, for example, and other languages to emphasize things, which is what this is for. But it's used so often in Latin in all kinds of very normal speech and very normal writing that it's incredibly mild. But what it is to swear by Hercules. So, me Hercules. So perhaps a shortened version of an expression like per me Hercules or something. It doesn't really matter. The point is that it's there are many variations. Me Hercules, Hercule, Mercules, Mercle. It's like saying geez or something. Especially since Hercules is also the son of a god. Maybe it's comparable in that way. It can be mapped on to our language as an idea, just to give you an idea. But there's other versions of this. Hercule, me Hercules, any version of that word is used by men traditionally. And however, we have other words, for example, swearing by pollux, which can be pol or edapol, which can be used by both men and women. Women, however, swear by castor, so they say me castor. Here, saying edapol or me Hercules would have been completely appropriate, but this word futuite, no. So I want to emphasize again that this actor, being Italian, sounds fantastic. Italians, Spaniards, other Romance speakers have a level of authenticity in their speech. There are more things that intonationally, phonetically, oral posture based that are in common between Romance language speakers than there are uncommon. Obviously, if one of you is from Italy or Brazil or Romania, you're going to say, well, Italians don't sound at all like we do, or whatever Romance language you happen to speak natively or are familiar with. And that's true. There are lots of differences. But what I'm saying is a speaker from Romania of Latin or from Italy, a native speaker of Catalan or Portuguese, Spanish, and so forth is going to carry that level of authenticity. Don't forget Sardinian. I can't forget Sardinian. Love Sardinian. So he sounds beautiful. The intonation, the cadence sounds great. The other thing here is that we hear some interesting shortening, particularly in the word istai. So istai, it sounds much more like he's saying actually iste or iste, which is in fact attested that in rustic Latin, the non-urban Roman Latin, rustic Latin, there's actually a common pronunciation of I as e. This was common enough for people to talk about it in the time period. So it's perfectly reasonable for a native Latin speaker to have this type of accent, where sometimes he'll sound a little bit less urbane, if you will. So he's saying, sounds more like belloiste, especially since he's also saying something just to his friends casually. He's changing his speech. I don't know if this is deliberate or not, but I buy it very much as being authentic. So he's also saying porro. I think I hear a long final O here. The final O can be shortened in situations, so it could be porro. Instead of porro, it definitely sounds, maybe long or short, it sounds really good to me. And he's also saying nil, the contracted form of nihil. That intervocalic H is in fact attested as having been removed in speech. We see it in poetry all the time, nil instead of nihil. Both pronunciations are current for this time period. It's fantastic.
Ustac, Roma tributa vostra non amplius remisuras.
Metellus, the character here, played by Valerio Morigi, does something else that I love, which is he's saying vostra instead of vestra. An archaic and, in fact, later Latin form of vester, or vestra in this case, meaning yours, plural, is vostra. Now this form ends up becoming the one which gets inherited into almost all the Romance languages, whereas the classical form, the Vester, appears to be something more associated exclusively with the classical urban Latin of this time period. So he's affecting a slightly rustic sound. Really cool. Great to hear this alternative pronunciation because it is a part of the Latin language of this period. So it sounds great. So it says, Postac Roma tributa vostra non amplius remissurast. We also have a contraction of remissura est. In my transcription here, I've written it with the apostrophe, but you could write it est, remissura est, but you still would pronounce it normally, remissurast. Sounds really, really good. The only nitpick here is that his non, the vowel sounds short. He's saying something closer to non amplius remissurast instead of non amplius. So the non and the am should be about the same weight or length.
Varus exigit ab omni tribu pretium viceum boum, vel quinquagenum ponderum frumenti centenari.
Okay, so some interesting things here. So Varus exigit ad omni so he says omni tribu instead of omni tribu. This first E vowel is too long. It sounds like it's tribu instead of tribu. It should be short. But he does say omni with a long final I vowel here, which is good. A long final E. Omni tribu is what it should be. And then we hear pretium, a long E vowel instead of a short one. Pretium instead of, so he's saying pretium. And these features we don't expect to see in any form of Latin until a good deal later. Now, English is 20 cows. I'm hearing dicenum, like a the sound. I must be mishearing something because vicenum is what it should be. So I've written that in the transcription here. So pretium vicenum boum. And the only complete here again would be vowel lengths. If this E vowel should be longer, vicenum, not vicenum. But then he lengthens boum instead of saying boum. This one is short. Vel quinquagenum sounded really good. So here, the vowel lengths again are the only issue. The A in quinquagenum sounds too short. It's quinquagenum, not quinquagenum, which it sounds closer to what he's actually doing here in this clip. Ponderum frumenti, and he also shortens the U in frumenti. He says frumenti. It should be frumenti. And also again in centenari, the unstressed long vowels. This is very typical, really, of most native speakers of Western European languages, including English speakers as well as Italians, but especially in Italians, this is audible because in Italian, an open syllable, if it's stressed, is when it's long, and if it's unstressed, the vowel will be short. So the very nature of Latin is directly contrary to a very important part of Italian phonology. So Valerio here, outstanding actor, doing great, but these are difficult things to overcome in one's native pronunciation. So he's fantastic for his Italianness, and also it's holding him back. But this is true of all of us. We all have our own accents.
Quid? Diciterum.
So the quid here, fantastic. It's a short E vowel. Keep in mind that short letter I is in fact E. It's not I, as commonly pronounced in Latin where it's taught in, say, Germany. In English-speaking countries, it is in fact quid. Perfectly done. Metatron has a great video about this, by the way. And we know this from ample evidence, both from Roman grammarians and otherwise. Then he says, diciterum. And his dic, this is a long vowel. It sounds like he's kind of inverting a kind of compensatory lengthening of the letter C here. So he's saying diciterum or something, like a geminated letter C, or even maybe a short vowel. It's a minor nitpick, but diciterum is more like how I would say it.
Spatium vobis est tridum.
Fantastic. Spatium vobis est tridum. Spatium vobis est tridum. Even sounds a little bit like he's saying spatium. Not exactly, but it sounds approaching that. Such things have been attested decades prior in the timeline here, even in Virgil, so that kind of thing is absolutely fine. He keeps his A in spatium short, so spatium vobis est tridum. Or did he do this? I didn't check. But he sounds great. Fantastic line. Okay, so I know this video is almost entirely about the Latin, but I can't help myself. Metatron's definitely going to talk about this in more detail, but Why on earth would a Roman camp have no fortifications? Clearly these people have been here for more than a day, and even if they weren't, their first duty would have been to build the walls. And their tents are right up against the tree line. It's just asking for some barbari to stroll right on in. So I find this really ridiculous that there's no fortifications anywhere, actually, in this series. They probably did that either for plot reasons or for saving money. But this is a CGI shot. I don't know why they couldn't have just put some walls in here and found some other excuse to get our characters, spoiler alert, into this Roman camp in a later part of the show. But so this really bothers me.
Nunc demum aduenisti, fili miei.
All right, now we have Varus. This is played by Gaetano Aronica. Fabulous actor. I really loved his performance in here. I think he probably has the strongest non-authentic sounding accent of the three main Latin speakers that we get in the show, which are Metellus, Arminius, and of course Varus. He has a very distinct Italian traits in it. For example, he says, Nunc demum aduenisti.
Nunc demum aduenisti.
And what's particularly here that stands out, which I'll be pointing out a lot of, is that Italian, since almost every word in Italian ends with a vowel, to end lots of words with consonants is strange, and similar to what the Japanese do. They add a little vowel sound, something like a schwa normally, or an e, after a lot of final consonants. So I hear nunc demum here instead of nunc demum. In fact, it's, as we know, final M is not a consonant in actual natively spoken Latin of any period of the recorded literary history, except in certain situations. But here in front of a vowel, demum aduenisti. Nunc demum, in fact, nunc, it would be a g sound because it's in front of a voiced consonant, which is the d here, the letter D. So nunc demum aduenisti is what we should be hearing, but we're not. We're hearing nunc demum, nunc demum. However, it's interestingly, if you go back far enough, you do in fact see that this final letter C was que. Letter C, letter E together, que. Nunc, for example, nuncine is a way to say now, nuncine. So that's preserved in certain forms. But at this point, we would expect nunc demum aduenisti. The nuncine is kind of a fossilized form. It doesn't seem to represent speech. Because what we're doing, why is this not good? Okay, so like, why do we learn to speak Latin? Besides it being really cool, it's so that we can understand the literature better. So this is why I'm very interested in authentic ancient pronunciations of Latin. If we have a good sounding ancient pronunciation, then we're able to appreciate the literature that we're reading aloud better. Now, of course, there's literature from all periods of history, from the Renaissance. In fact, most of the literature that exists in Latin is from the Renaissance and medieval period, and even after that. Whereas the classical works, copious as they are some 2% of the whole corpus. However, since those are a really important and foundational part of Latin literature, and people are usually very interested in that. That's why we get interested in this classical, restored classical pronunciation of Latin. And it is really good to hear Italians using it because they can sound in many ways better than almost anyone else for a variety of other reasons, like vowel quality, vowel placement, and so forth. But here he says, nunc demum aduenisti. But the final should have some kind of synaleiphe, synaloipe, where we have a merger, because final is a vowel. Demum aduenisti.
In Germaniam optatus ades.
In Germaniam, he says, in Germaniam optatus ades. I actually find it hard to do that. The final M as a consonant. Not authentic. For this period, I find it highly unlikely that this would occur. Such occurrences are virtually unattested. So, in Germania optatus ades is definitely how it should be. His rhythm is lacking because the short and long syllables, you don't hear the interchange of long and short syllables, which is so foundation to the Latin language of the classical period. So, in Germania optatus ades. So, optatus ades is what we would expect to hear. Optatus ades. Whereas the short us, short a, and so there's some fudging there again. It's particularly of the lengthening of the a and ades, making a and the des about the same length when they shouldn't be. Tiny little things. The other part, of course, is as an Italian, he doesn't have, like most Italians, he doesn't have the retracted S sound. Few English speakers, few Italians, few Germans, depending. Few English speakers, few Italians have the retracted S sound, which is typical of Finnish, European Spanish, modern Greek, which is s, where the tip of the tongue is raised and about behind the top incisors, instead of as in English, where most speakers of English, which it's s, it's a higher pitch, so s as opposed to sh. And that distinctly stands out to people who are native speakers of languages which have it. For example, if you're learning Greek today, just like ancient Greek, it has this sound, the reason why I've explained in another video, which you should go check out.
Gratum est, ostam diutinam moram, iterum te videre.
In this sentence, we also have some vowel length problems. So he says gratum est, again with the final M consonant. This, if it occurs, it's going to be extremely rare. So for his Germanium optatus, gratum est, no, definitely not authentic at all to natively spoken Latin of almost any time period. So gratust or gratuest or something. But hearing a final ma, no, that's not going to be correct. So gratust, gratuest, something like that would be right. And here he says moram instead of moram. And moram, the o needs to be short. It's only one mora in linguistic terms. So moram. And he inserts hiatus, that is a natural break here, almost like a pause. So he says moram, iterum te videre. Sounds great. His vowel qualities sound fantastic. We don't hear too much of a high E vowel, even though that would probably be okay for the time period. As you've seen from my Calabrese pronunciation of Latin video about classical pronunciation of Latin, we expect the vowel qualities of e and o more open rather than close in classical Latin. So he sounds really good when it comes to that.
In ac insanorum terra, te consilisque tuis vulgari meuti possum.
So against the vowel length things, he says insanorum, but it's insanorum, insanorum, insanorum. The a is just as long as the o, which follows, insanorum. But it's terra, it has a long sound, maybe just because he's trailing off, but it sounds really good. It sounds fantastic. Nice long terra. So, in ac insanorum terra, te consilisque tuis pulcherri meuti possum. That's how I would say it. He sounds pretty good for the whole line, though, with that one exception. The transcription of all the dialogue in episode 1 I'm making available to my Patreon supporters. The link is in the description.
Scrutis istis vic sculus tergitur.
So, scrutis istis vic sculus tergitur. Sounds fantastic. Only thing I'd want would be a retracted S sound on weeks instead of weeks, weeks. And scrutis instead of scrutis. It sounds more Italian, doesn't it? Say scrutis. This is an aspect where Spanish, European Spanish, sounds a bit more authentic in that particular regard, the retracted S. So scrutis istis vic sculus tergitur. Also, it's nice here to see tergitur instead of tergetur. Tergitur, a variant of this verb. So if you know what that is. So this is nice. It's tergitur instead of tergetur. It's an interesting variety, consistent with the rusticity of metellus of this particular speaker. The thing I love the most about this line is all the syllable weights or lengths are perfect. Scrutis istis vic sculus tergitur. That's exactly how he says it, with the exception of the retracted S. It is beautiful.
Again!
Oh, Valerio, perché? So, I don't know where the dialogue coach was this day, but it's not age, for two reasons. One is the stress is wrong. It's age. And this is because final words in Latin, with the exception of one we already saw, post ac, and a number of words that end in a final C, they're not stressed on the final syllable. So it's not age. No, absolutely not. It's age. The other problem is that he's not speaking to just one person. This is an imperative plural. Agite is the correct verb here.
Hoc minim est compareius quod Roma exigit.
This is a very good sounding line again by our character Metellus. Hoc minim est compareius. And this is the only place where I think he slipped up. He says compareius, but this a is long, so it should be compareius. Compareius quod Roma exigit. Quod Roma exigit. I think everything else sounds outstanding.
Legatus Varus signum fidei vestrae erga Roma manet.
Okay, first thing, great that we hear the variation. He said vostra in the previous scene. Here he says vestrae. And he's talking about the signum, so maybe that's why whoever wrote the dialogue decided, oh, let's make him sound classier or more urban for this particular word, about your fidelity towards the Roman Empire, towards Rome. So legatus varus signum fidei vestere erga Romam manet. Sounds really good with the exception of one, shall I call it an Italianism, where he says varus signum, where there is an insertion of another whole syllable, varus signum, and it's basically a schwa, varusa. We don't want to do that. And the reason we don't want to do that is it takes us away from the literature of the period. It takes us away from how people actually spoke in this time. So if we're just using Latin conventionally in school, in Italy, for example, whatever, but it's something that is essentially what I call a vitium of speech of the way Italians treat Latin. Of course, there are plenty of vitia that I have in my own speech when I speak Latin. I've talked about them before. And so this is something to be avoided. So not varus signum, but varus signum. Something else he does, he says legatus instead of legatus. And this is a long e vowel. So legatus varus signum. Bum, 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 bum. Isn't that nice? With the stresses, the stressed syllables, it sounds like Caesar or something. It's because a lot of Caesar's text include this a lot of heavy or long syllables in a sequence. Legatus varus signum. It's great. Unfortunately, the actor here, Valerio Morigi, doesn't quite give us that feeling because he says legatus varus signum. So this creation of one short syllable and the shortening of one of the long syllables affects the rhythm. And that's a shame because that feeling is really, really important to all of Latin literature, and it's definitely authentic to have these long vowels in unstressed syllables in the classical period. He also says erga Romam manet. It's a long final a, erga Romam. I would not expect it to be shortened. Such shortenings are extremely rare in literature. Maybe it's okay. I wouldn't expect it to be a particularly rustic trait necessarily to say erga instead of erga. It stands out to me. Erga Romam manet. Otherwise, the ma, it didn't sound overlong to me. It sounded okay. Erga Romam manet. It is a short ma. He sounds it's a bit longer than I would do it, but I think it's definitely good enough.
Basiet aquilam dux vester.
So most of this sounds fantastic. I like how we are with his basiet. It almost sounds like basiet or basiet. He says it really fast, very normally. I think this actor, I think all of them on the whole sound like they really know what they're saying. And this is definitely an example. The only problem I have here is not with the vowel lengths or the syllable lengths, except in the word aquilam. He says aquilam. It's not aquilam, it's aquilam. And that's, of course, as I mentioned, a very big deal. So instead of basiet aquilam dux vester, it should be basiet aquilam dux vester. Everything else is perfect.
Age.
And again with the age. Why is it stressed on the ge? Utterly baffling to me. He's doing everything else so well.
Ingenua.
This is good. I don't think he's attempting to make it a short e. He's probably allowing his native Italianness to allow it to be a long ge. Ingenua is what I'm hearing, a longer e, whereas it should be ingenua, a shorter e vowel sound. The way he's saying it here in the context, I could definitely trick myself to believe he's saying ingenua and not saying ingenua. So I like this line. It's definitely good enough.
Roma! Victrix! Roma Victrix!
Fantastic, sounds great. Roma Victrix. If you're saying it faster together, the ma would definitely be short. Roma Victrix. But on the way they're shouting it, it sounds really good. The only thing here that baffles me is why on earth these Roman soldiers would be doing this. Their mission at the time was to make friends and allies, not to impose exorbitant taxes. It's not really a good depiction of what's going on in history at this point. I could definitely recommend a video by Historia Civilis, where he talks about this whole battle and the reason for Varus being there. And it's really strange to utterly change the facts of history and the purpose for their being there, from the barbarians' perspective or whatever. It just doesn't make sense because all that something like this would do would create an uprising. And the Romans were generally pretty good at making friends and allies and bringing satellite nations into association with the empire. Why would they be doing this whole thing? Anyway, so that bothers me, but that's sort of part of the whole plot, which I'm not going to extensively critique in this video. Oh my god, this camp. Oh my god, this camp. Why is it right next to the tree line? Asking for an ambush.
Paxuma pars tribum deditionem fecit.
I actually hear this now. I'm pretty sure he's saying maxuma or maxima instead of maxima. He even seems to have the sonus medius, which where there's a labial consonant like a ma or a ba. Occasionally the e, where we usually write the letter I. It's written as u, and this is a more archaic feature of Latin, which is still part of the Latin language. It also has a rusticity to it, which is great. It's even used by Apuleius in the 2nd century AD to depict more rustic speakers of Latin as well, which kind of makes sense if it's from, Romans are coming from Latium, speaking in a certain way, and they go around these places and they conquer them. They bring them into the Roman Republic and later Empire, and so they retain older things, just as, for example, American English retains certain older features of English, as do other dialects that are in England, other accents, whereas standard British English, or RP, doesn't have them anymore. For example, the final R that we say in most American English, that's not typical of a lot of British English, certainly in southern England, is an older feature that we retain. Of course, there's lots of novel features in American English as well, but anyway, I like this a lot. Maxuma pars is what I hear, and it sounds really good. Other thing I'll nitpick on, same thing as before, a long vowel and an open syllable, deditionem. He says deditionem instead of deditionem. This is not merely a feature of urban Latin. This is fundamental to the Latin language everywhere, so it should be deditionem, not merely deditionem, even in this time period, even in a more rustic sounding Latin. So that's definitely a mistake, if you will. Either the dialogue coaches, who were Hungarian, if I'm not mistaken, I'll check here, throw it up on the screen, who should have known better, because Hungarian is a language which has long vowels and unstressed syllables. Hungarian has a lot in common with classical Latin pronunciation, so I'll just call that a shame. But if you've ever heard Hungarians speak Latin, it is so beautiful, because they do all this vowel length stuff perfectly. And half the time they don't even know it. They're just taught that way in school. Because, of course it's a long vowel. It's like, oh, I love them. They're great.
Etiam tributa contulit.
Only here in nitpick, etiam tributa contulit. So Italian, when we have a stressed vowel that's in an open syllable, in this case tributa, the bu, it's phonemically long. Italian doesn't need to say that. For example, amare in Italian. But you can say amare if you're speaking quickly, and it's all right. It's not non-Italian. And he's doing that here. He's compressing it into etiam tributa contulit instead of etiam tributa contulit, keeping that bu a little bit longer. So I hear it as the exact same weight, syllable weight or length as the others that it's next to. I'd call that a teensy-weensy little error.
Atnoniste.
Atnoniste.
Atnoniste. Now, having a final vowel, which even though it's phonemically short, might be extended because it's the end of speaking, is utterly normal. It happens a lot in Japanese, for example, which also has phonemic vowel length. So I think this is great. Atnoniste. Atnoniste. Sounds really good. Again, the retracted S is what I would like to hear. The only thing I would question is possibly the use of iste. Now, iste is often taught in typical grammar books as being derisive or pejorative, but it's not fundamentally. It just means that next to you. So what's kind of throwing me here is he's talking to Varus, but he's saying ille, that guy, but non ille, or at least non hic, because he's close to me and you're not close to him, Varus. So he's saying non iste. I find that a little off. Maybe it could work though, because the pronoun iste is what ends up becoming, say, este in Spanish and questo in Italian and a lot of other Romance languages. They take this pronoun as the word for this, and the other word would hic, hikaikok, ends up leaving most of the other Romance languages. Not Catalan though, if I'm not mistaken. I think it has survived there, and we see it crop up in some other Romance languages as well. So maybe he's really kind of meaning this guy, and so Varus is always saying, but not this guy, just echoing him. In which case, it doesn't bother me as much, but it's definitely kind of like, I wouldn't say it that way. The actor playing Varus Gaetano again does it says atenoniste, atenoniste. What he's doing is he's geminating the T and he's adding a little I syllable after it. Atenoniste. Don't do that. That's not going to work for the proper rhythm. Again, the rhythm is the foundation of all the prose and all the poetry. It's so important if we want to achieve an authentic sound for classical Latin. Again, we're nitpicking, but this is a pretty big one. In fact, I would just like to add that if vowel lengths are not respected, even if you're saying wa instead of va and que instead of che and all the other differences between ecclesiastical and classical Latin, that's much more of a hindrance not to do those proper phonemic vowel lengths and syllable lengths than it is to worry about que and che and deditionem versus deditionem. For example, Stefano Vittori, one of the best, most fluent and beautiful sounding speakers of Latin who is alive today, he actually prefers the ecclesiastical pronunciation, though he does almost immaculate, fantastically authentic 1st century AD sounding Latin. So he would say either deditionem if you're using a classical pronunciation, but he could also do dedizione. But he would keep the phonemic vowel lengths long where they belong. And he's also not going to be adding these little schwa sounds. He won't say atenoniste. And I'll link to some videos where he's modeling this. So in general, this is definitely my soapbox. The phonemic vowel length is the most important part to access and appreciate the literature. Now, if you do that and you get the right consonant sounds, well, then that's just fantastic. And all the right vowel qualities, but those lengths of vowels are non-negotiable, in my opinion.
Concedo tibi spem extremam, barbare.
So, concedo tibi spem extremam, barbare. Sounds fine, except for spem. He's saying spem extremam instead of spem extremam. I wouldn't expect the final M to become a hard, true consonant here, just as before. He says concedo tibi. The final O in concedo doesn't sound especially long, but again, that's okay. The reason is that final O and final I, final O and I vowel letters, they are always long in Latin, except when indeed they are made short, which is a matter of convention. Preference, so it doesn't matter. So if he indeed said concedo tibi, that would be just fine. But the problem here is with this spem extremam.
Tribus itame non intelligent. Apud Deus ius vetat, quemquam capite damnari ab alio homine.
All right, great. So now we have the main character, Arminius, speaking. I gotta tell you, Laurens Rupp here, Austrian actor, wonderful. He has definitely the lion's share of the dialogue of any of the characters and has to do both Latin and his native German, and he does them extremely well. And I asked an Austrian German friend of mine, Alexa, what she thought of both his Latin and German in the show. He apparently doesn't have very Austrian sound of his German when he's speaking German. Now, keep in mind, by the way, people have complained a lot about, oh, this isn't historically accurate, they're speaking modern German. Well, this is a show made by native German speakers for a native German-speaking audience. So it wasn't made for you. I'm just kidding. No, it was made for all of us, but the point is that this is not any worse than, say, in the wonderful movie Amadeus. Hey, that's a good name. From 1984, where all of the main characters, it's an American-made movie, made for an American-speaking audience, certainly native English-speaking audience, and all the characters there who are Austrians, interestingly, for the most part, who are native German speakers, they're all just speaking English, normal American-sounding English in the movie, whereas every other language that appears, like Italian or whatever, whenever Latin, whenever it appears, it always is in that language. So it's a matter of cinematic convenience. Not everything has to be perfectly accurate. And moreover, we don't have extensive dialogues and scripts of Proto-Germanic. Whatever we construct would be guessing. And in fact, I think this is really interesting. And why learning Latin is so cool is that we have this, like when I look into history, thanks to all these wonderful things I've read, I feel like I can see, the forum, I can see these characters, these people, I can see the historic events where these Romans and ancient Greeks were present in unbelievably vivid detail, all the way back to the 5th century BC in the case of the Greeks. But contemporarily, at the 1st century AD, German stuff is just like, there's so little that's written except from, of course, the Roman perspective. So it's just so murky anyways. And I find that really neat and a really valuable way to learn the immortal language of Latin, because it's so valuable to connect us to history. Now, the wonderful actor Laurens Roep, I asked him on Instagram if he actually studied Latin, because he sounds so good when he speaks. Unlike the other actors, for example, Gaetano here, I don't believe he speaks Latin because of certain intonational things that he does, which we'll talk about. Whereas the actor playing Arminius, which is Laurens, he sounds legit to me. He sounds like he's actually been speaking Latin in Latin-speaking communities for a while. Now, he could just be an outstanding actor, which I think he is, or he could actually have some spoken Latin experience. It's just weird because I don't know him. I know all Latin speakers. Just kidding. I know most of them. Or I just would have expected to have heard of him if he is, in fact, as good as I feel like he sounds to me. Now, some things he does really well, which may be completely incidental and based on listening to him in interviews speak German with a slight Austrian accent. Thank you again, Alexa. He has the retracted S sound. So I think this is part of his native pronouncing of the S. So he's not saying tribus. He's saying tribus. So he's saying not s, but sh. And that is so fantastically authentic sounding for the ancient Latin language, also true of ancient Greek, true of modern Finnish, modern European Spanish. So it's a fantastic thing to hear. So tribusitam non intelligit. I don't think you can get better than that. That sounds fantastic. That sounds how I would want to pronounce it. So great job, Laurens.
Tribusitam non intelligent. Apudeos ius vetat, quemquam capite damnari ab alio homine.
So cool that he's definitely saying homine and not homine. And I would have to guess that the dialogue coaches told him to say it that way, where the initial H here is silent, because we know that in certain kinds of speech in Rome, the pronunciation of H was becoming weak. Eventually, the H sound does disappear from Latin, finally centuries later. So I would expect some people to pronounce it and some not to. The fact that he's younger than Varus suggests that he picked it up as a part of the changing and evolving speech of the 1st century AD, where, of course, Varus grew up in the late 1st century BC, some decades before. So I think that's a really cool touch. My only complaint there is that he's saying alio homine with a distinct hiatus, where he's breaking it up, putting in a glottal stop in between, which it just doesn't sound right here. I definitely don't recommend that pedagogically. However, this isn't his first language. The fact that he learned Latin as a second language, I don't know how old he was when he was taken as a child, but if he was on that cusp of puberty, we'd expect him to retain some kind of Germanic accent. And if that since he is, of course, a native German speaker in reality, for him to retain something like that just adds to the authenticity for me. However, I think his Latin sounds really good, very good for imitation. And he also sounds so good with his vowel lengths there. You heard him say it. I'm going to say it really similar to him just now. Apodeos jus vetat quemquam capite damnari ab alio homine. The only thing I'm doing is I'm eliding the alio homine, and his damnari, it sounded really good with the syllable length there. So I'm impressed, Laurens. But do you speak Latin? I haven't seen you in any of the conventions. I wrote to you. Kannst du bitte antworten? Bitte, bitte.
Io suero Germanicum nullum. Verum autem Roma. Tandem eis experto opust.
All right, some things to say here. Jus vero Germanicum nullum. Sounded really good the way Gaetano, here playing Varus, said it. Another thing I'd complain here about, well, it's not really a complaint. He said vero, but as we spoke of, final O can be short. So it doesn't have to be vero, it could be vero. Even in this time period, absolutely. Certainly part of the conversational or non-formal language. I think that's fine. However, he says, again, verum autem, final M, not a consonant, verum autem, just not allowing the lips to contract. Whether it's a nasal vowel or not is not as important, but saying verum autem, not good authentically. Everything else sounds fine. Tan deis experto opust. So I love experto opust. His pronunciation is fantastic. If you had the retracted S, it's immaculate. He's using the expression opus est in conversational language, opust is a contraction that we would expect to have occur, opust. Glorious writing on the part of the translators. And experto, so this is experiri. And this is, we don't see this too often, but it's a wonderful way to express things in Latin. Experto opust, so experiri opust, so it's necessary to experience. But it's put into this form, taking a past participle, the adjective form, ablative case, experto opust. Really good.
Ite, ac, vos, ilac.
I really like this. It's laconic, it's simple. Ite, ac. In fact, I don't hear the initial H. I think that's another choice by him or by the dialogue coach not to have that. Definitely a feature of some Roman speech. And the fact that he would pick that up as a child in Rome totally works for me. And then vos, ilac. He sounds really good. That's the last line of dialogue I'm going to cover for this episode. So this is pretty much a deep dive into most of the lines of dialogue in this first episode. If you like this, let me know in the comments, and I can do this for every episode if you really want. As you see, I decided to let my barbarian beard grow out today. If you like the beard, give this video a thumbs up. If you don't, share this video with a friend and ask their opinion. See what I did there? Final word about the show's Latin use in general. The Latin dialogue is well written with some mistakes. The pronunciation choosing to have predominantly Italian actors use classical Latin pronunciation is an excellent choice. They sound fantastic. On the whole, some of the best I've ever heard in cinema. I strongly encourage this to continue. If there's a second season of this show, or if there are other shows that come out like it, and of course if you want to hire a dialect coach, definitely do that, because you're going to get a really interesting, authentic product. Just like having authentic costumes, armor, it adds to the flavor of the experience for the viewer, especially for those of us who are so picky. We love when these things are done right with that kind of care and attention that brings us in. Maybe the general viewer isn't going to notice this sort of thing, but thanks to the interconnected communities we have now, they can ask people who are into Latin, the language, its pronunciation. That is, people who aren't, maybe that interested in specific things. People can go and ask Metatron, hey, what do you think of the armor? And Metatron could say, yeah, it was really great except for these things. And that way, that adds to people's excitement about the shows. I really strongly encourage what they're doing. More historical dramas with even higher levels of historical accuracy, I strongly promote. Thanks so much for watching. My love to my Patreon supporters. Really appreciate what you're doing for me and for this channel. Gratias wobi sago walete.